So you still think Bigfoot is nothing more than a myth? Can I blame you, though? Maybe not.
I remember my friends laughing at me when I told them I saw the big guy on my grandpa's farm. Thought I was seeing things, and for a long time I believed them.
Until I realized something important. I wasn't the only one.
There were others who'd seen him too. Some didn't just catch a glimpse. Some claimed they saw more than one. A whole group, watching, moving together. And then there were people like Beck and his men. Men who didn't just see something in the distance, but men who were forced to face them. Men who were surrounded by them. Men who barely made it out alive.
The world heard their story. But for those men, the story didn't end when the headlines faded. Whatever happened to them out there, it stayed with them.
Welcome to Steve's Stories. If you haven't guessed it already, I'm Steve, and this is where we dig into the encounters people don't talk about, the ones that don't sit right, the ones that never really go away. And this one? Well, this one begins in a place that feels quiet until you know what happened there. Chapter 1. The Attack.
Life was hard back then. You were either something or you weren't. Beck wasn't. Not then. And he had to go out there hoping to change that.
That night, he lay in a small wooden cabin in the middle of nowhere, staring into the dark, hoping this would be the last time he ever had to sleep like this. Then
something enormous slammed into it from the outside, and the whole cabin shuddered.
For a second, no one moved.
Beck lay there listening, trying to make sense of it.
Another impact, closer this time, heavier. Now there was no doubt something was out there, and it was not small. This wasn't a pebble. It wasn't loose debris rolling down a slope. Whatever hit that cabin had weight behind it, enough to punch straight through the roof and send splintered wood crashing down inside. Before they could even react, another one came, then another, from every direction. The men were on their feet before they were even fully awake, rifles in hand, hearts pounding, bodies moving on instinct alone. Years of hard labor had trained them for moments like this, but nothing had prepared them for what was happening now.
Through the gaps in the logs, they heard it.
Movement. Not from one side, from everywhere, all at once. Beck was not alone out here. He had Marion Smith with him, along with Roy, Marion's teenage son, Gabe Lefevre, and John Peterson. 5 men deep in the wilderness around Mount St. Helens in the summer of 1924, chasing something that had brought countless others before them. The promise of striking gold. They weren't the first. They wouldn't be the last. Gold had been found in these rivers for decades, and men had been pouring into the region ever since, each one believing they might be the one to finally walk away rich. Most didn't. The land made sure of that. It was steep, dense, and unforgiving. The kind of place where a man could disappear and never be found again. For Beck and his group, that isolation was part of the plan. They built their cabin log by log in a clearing surrounded by old forest, far enough from everything that no one would disturb them. At least, that's what they thought, because they weren't alone. It started with sound, at first just a whistle, high, distant, drifting down from somewhere along the ridgeline as the light faded each evening. Then another, further off, answering it.
It wasn't a bird. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, deliberate.
Like something calling out and something else replying. On quieter nights, there was something else too. A deeper sound, slow, rhythmic, like a dull, heavy thud repeating over and over again. Almost like something beating against its own chest. Marion Smith had heard stories like this before, old stories, passed around for decades by miners and locals alike. Stories about something in these mountains, something they called the Mountain Devils.
Now, most men laughed these stories off until they didn't. Because then came the tracks.
Not once, not twice, again and again and again. Pressed deep into the soft ground in places no normal footprint should be. Large, wide, heavy. Beck would later describe them as 13, maybe 14 inches long. 4 blunt toes. No mistaking the weight behind them. Whatever was leaving those tracks, it was not passing through. It was staying close, watching. But no one said it out loud, not one of them. Because out there, saying it makes it real.
And once it's real, you can't pretend it isn't there anymore.
Chapter 2. The Siege.
Inside the fragile cabin, the men, they weren't waiting anymore. They were surviving.
Beck would later admit he was grateful he wasn't alone because whatever circled them out there in the dark, it wasn't just one thing. Through the cracks in the walls, through the gaps in the shattered roof, they could feel it. Movement, numbers, presence. 15, maybe 30 of them, surrounding the cabin, closing in. And these weren't curious visitors. They came to kill. The first signs had been the roof. A massive rock crashed through it, splintering wood like it was nothing. It tore a hole straight into the night above them. For a brief moment, it felt like luck might still be on their side. Then another rock came down. This one didn't miss. It struck Fred Beck square in the head, dropping him hard, the sound swallowed by everything else breaking around him. There was no time to check him, no time to think, because something else was already coming. The door.
Something enormous slammed into it from the outside, and the whole cabin shuddered.
Once, twice, again. Each hit heavier than the last. They'd built that cabin strong, logs tight, frame solid, but whatever was out there didn't care. It just kept hitting, again and again and again. Roy, Gabe, and John didn't hesitate. They threw themselves against the door, pressing their full weight into it as the wood groaned under the strain. Boards were ripped from a bunk bed and jammed into place, wedged into cracks, anything to buy time. Their boots dug into the floor, their shoulders locked, their bodies became the last barrier between whatever was outside and everything inside. And then they saw it.
At first, it didn't make sense. Just movement in the dark, a shape where no shape should be.
Then it pushed through. A hand. Not human. Too large, too thick, covered in coarse, dark hair. Fingers curling, feeling, reaching through the broken edge of the door, like it knew exactly what it wanted. And what it wanted was inside. The axe. It had been leaning quietly against the wall, forgotten in the panic, but not forgotten by whatever was out there.
The hand reached for it, closed around it, and started to pull.
For a split second, no one moved because none of it made sense. It was pitch black. How could it know the axe was there? How could it reach so precisely? Had it been inside before? The questions came fast, but survival came faster. One of the men lunged forward, grabbing the axe handle with both hands, planting his feet, pulling back with everything he had. The wood of the door frame splintered around the creature's arm as the two sides fought over that single tool.
Inside, it was their best chance. Outside, it was their end.
Because if that door gave way and something holding an axe came through with it, there wouldn't be a fight. There would be nothing left. They strained, slipped, pulled, men against something far stronger than any man should be, and somehow they held on. Barely.
But the siege didn't stop. Not for a second.
Rocks kept coming, smashing through the roof, slamming into walls, crashing into the floor. With the door blocked, the things outside changed tactics, testing every weakness, every inch of that cabin. So the men fired, blindly. Through the walls, through the roof, at shapes they could only half see. Gunfire cracked through the night, echoing off the canyon, but it never felt like enough. Not against something they couldn't count, couldn't track, couldn't understand.
They were under siege, not by animals, not by something they could name, just something.
Something organized enough to surround them, strong enough to tear through their shelter, smart enough to reach for a weapon in the dark. And as the hours dragged on, the realization settled in, heavier than any stone crashing through that roof. They didn't know if the cabin would hold. They didn't know if the walls would last. They didn't even know if they would live long enough to see the sky turn gray. Sleep didn't matter anymore. Nothing did.
Because out there, just beyond the firelight, they were waiting. And it didn't look like they were going anywhere.
Chapter 3. First Blood. Beck had already lost consciousness by then, but if he hadn't, the weight of it would have crushed him.
Because the truth is, they had seen the signs, but they ignored them.
It started earlier, quiet, almost forgettable at the time. Two of the men had gone down to the spring, just like they'd done before. Nothing unusual, just water, just another part of the routine. Until they realized they weren't alone. Across the water on the far bank, something stood beside a pine tree, upright, not shifting, not rising, just standing there like it belonged that way.
For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke.
The kind of silence that creeps in when your brain is trying to make sense of something it doesn't recognize, something it doesn't want to recognize. And then it moved, not toward them, not away, just a step back, slipping behind the tree like it understood it had been seen. And then it leaned out again, slowly, looking straight at them.
That was the moment everything broke. Rifles came up.
3 shots cracked through the trees, then 3 more, fast, panicked, loud enough to shatter whatever stillness had been left in that place. The figure lurched, moving in a way that didn't look right, dodging between trees before disappearing down toward the gorge.
And just like that, it was gone. No one followed, no one checked. No one wanted to.
Maybe it was wounded, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it had only been startled. In the chaos of the moment, none of them stopped to find out.
And later, Beck tried to put it into words.
He said it stood close to 7 feet tall, towering in a way that didn't feel natural. But it wasn't just the height, it was the build. Broad shoulders, powerful. A body that looked like it belonged to something built for strength, and all of it covered in coarse, dark hair, black, maybe brown. Hard to tell in that light. Now, it would be easy to say it was a bear. They wished it was a bear. At least a bear made sense. At least a bear followed the rules. But this walked on 2 legs, not clumsy, not rising for a moment like an animal startled, but steady, balanced, like it had done that its entire life, like it was meant to.
And that was the part that stayed with them. Because that's the part, well, they couldn't explain.
So that night, sitting around the fire, the 5 of them made a decision. Whatever they had seen, it wasn't staying. It knew where they were. It had watched them, and now it had been shot at. The plan felt simple. Finish out the day, get some rest, and leave at first light. Pack up, get out. Put distance between themselves and whatever was out there. A clean ending. A smart decision. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't have known, was that they weren't the only ones making plans. Because somewhere out there in the dark, beyond the reach of that fire, something else had already decided how the night was going to end. And if you look at what happened next, if you listen closely to the way the attack unfolded, it starts to feel like this wasn't random. It wasn't sudden. It was an answer.
Because just a few hours earlier, they'd fired first.
Chapter 4. Dawn.
So, it was too late to regret it now, but that didn't stop the thought from creeping in. Maybe they should have finished it.
Maybe they should have followed it into the trees, made sure it never got back up, never made it back to whatever else was out there. Because if it did make it back, if it told the others, then what was happening now, this siege this nightmare. It wasn't random. It was an answer. And maybe, just maybe, if they'd acted differently, the night would have been quiet. Just another cold stretch in the wilderness. No rocks tearing through the roof. No hands reaching through the door. No creatures in the dark trying to erase them from the face of the earth. But that wasn't the night they got. Just when it felt like everything was about to break, when their strength was fading and hope was slipping through their fingers.
Something changed. At first, it was subtle.
The impacts, they weren't as constant. The gaps between them stretched longer and longer. The movement on the roof, the shadows beyond the walls, the sounds, they were thinning out. The men noticed it slowly, cautiously, like they were afraid, even acknowledging it might bring it all crashing back.
Then, it stopped. Completely. No more rocks, no more footsteps, no more movement, just silence.
The kind of silence that doesn't feel like relief. The kind that presses in on you, heavy, uncertain, long. Because after everything they had just been through, there was no way to trust it. Had they survived? Or was this something else? Something waiting, watching, letting them breathe just long enough to step outside. No one said it out loud, but they were all thinking the same thing. This might not be over. Most people in that moment would have stayed put, reinforced what they could, waited for daylight to fully take hold before even thinking about moving, but
these men, they'd seen enough.
They gathered what little they had left, weapons first, supplies second, and made the decision to leave that place behind while they still could. Beck was barely steady, still recovering from the blow that had taken him out for nearly 2 hours. But staying wasn't an option. They'd already spent more than 2 hours fighting for their lives. They weren't about to wait for round 2. So they stepped out of the cabin, out into the clearing, out into a morning that looked far too calm for what had just happened.
And somehow that made it worse, because everything looked normal. Too normal.
The trees stood still. The air was quiet. The light crept slowly over the canyon like nothing had happened at all. But the feeling didn't leave. That sense that something was still there, watching, following, waiting.
And then Beck saw it.
Up along the ridge of the canyon against the pale light of the early morning, a figure, standing still. One of them, it hadn't left, it hadn't charged, hadn't thrown anything, hadn't made a sound. It was just watching. That alone was enough to send a chill through all of them, because after everything that had happened, after the violence, the noise, the chaos, this felt different, deliberate, calm, almost knowing. But Beck didn't wait to understand it, didn't want to. He raised his rifle, aimed, and fired. The shot cracked through the morning air. The figure staggered just for a moment, then slipped, falling backward over the edge and tumbling down into the gorge below, swallowed by the depth of it, gone from sight. No one followed, no one checked, no one needed to. They turned, and they walked, away from the cabin, away from the claim they had spent weeks building, away from the gold they had come there to find, away from every hour of work they had put into that place. The cabin didn't matter anymore. The claim didn't matter anymore. Nothing did. Because whatever was out there, they had survived it, and they weren't about to give it a second chance. Chapter 5. The Great Ape Hunt. And live they did. Somehow they made it out of that canyon, out of those woods and back to civilization. But no one walks through something like that and keeps it buried. Within a day, maybe 2, of stumbling back in a town, shaken and exhausted, the 5 miners found someone willing to listen. A local reporter sat with them, heard the story, every detail, every moment of the night. And once it was told, there was no stopping it. The Longview Daily News was the first to put it into print. The headline didn't ease people into it, didn't soften the edges. Kelso miners back from the mountain with a tale of mountain devils. That alone was enough to turn heads. But the next day, it spread. The Portland Oregonian picked it up, and this time the story came back bigger, louder, harder to ignore. A reported fight with giant apes, a cabin bombarded through the night. One of the creatures said to have been killed by the party.
Now it wasn't just a strange encounter. Now, it was a battle. And from there, it moved fast.
Within a week, the story had traveled across the country. Papers from Boston to Los Angeles carried their own versions, each one stretching a little further into the unknown. Some spoke of 8-foot ape men moving through the wilderness. Others hinted at lost tribes, creatures thought to be long extinct. There were even descriptions that claimed bodies more covered in hair than any bear.
The details changed, but the fear stayed the same. Because something had happened on that mountain. And people, they wanted to know what it was.
Armed groups began forming, men heading into the woods with rifles, convinced they could track whatever the miners had encountered. Some were looking for answers, others were looking for proof, and a few were looking for a fight. At the same time, the opposite reaction spread just as quickly. Tourists stopped coming, fishermen packed up and left. The wilderness around Mount St. Helens, once quiet, once inviting, started to feel like something else entirely. Like a place you didn't go, unless you had a reason. And even then, maybe not. As for the 5 men, they'd walked into those mountains as nobodies, just prospectors chasing the promise of gold, hoping to strike something that would change their lives.
Well, in a way, they did. Because they came back with something else entirely. A story. One that refused to fade.
One that pulled attention from across the country. One that turned them overnight into the center of something far bigger than they'd ever intended. They hadn't found gold, but they had uncovered something that would echo far beyond that canyon. Something that would spark what people would come to call
the Great Ape Hunt of 1924.
Chapter 6. The Rangers Go In.
Forest rangers eventually made their way up the mountain, drawn by the story, by the headlines, by the sheer weight of what was being claimed.
They expected something dramatic, something undeniable. What they found instead was something far more unsettling. The cabin was real. The damage was real. Logs splintered, the roof torn open, the structure battered in a way that couldn't be easily dismissed, and scattered around it. Stones, large ones, too large to ignore, too many to explain away as coincidence, and not quite matching the surrounding terrain in any obvious way. Something had happened there, that much they couldn't deny.
But then, the trail went cold.
At the base of the gorge, where Beck swore he had shot one of the creatures, where it had fallen into the darkness below, there was nothing. No blood, no body, no sign that anything had ever hit the ground at all. And the deeper they looked, the stranger it became. Because there was no hair, no remains, no physical proof that something living, something unknown had ever been there. Just a broken cabin and a story.
Then came the tracks. At first, they seemed promising. Impressions in the dirt around the cabin, shapes that might have been footprints.
But the longer the rangers studied them, the less they made sense. At least 2 of them came to the same conclusion.
But those weren't footprints. They looked wrong.
As if they'd been made deliberately, not by something walking, by something pressing down. Human knuckles driven into the soil to mimic something larger, something stranger. No tracks left behind, but tracks created. And that was the moment everything began to shift. Because now the question wasn't just what happened out there. It was who made it look that way. To some, it started to feel like a setup, an elaborate prank carefully staged, or something more calculated, something meant to spread, to grow, to take on a life of its own. The Rangers didn't keep their doubts quiet. They spoke publicly, clearly, stating that whatever had been reported, whatever had been printed in those papers, the so-called gorilla men, were nothing more than a myth, a story, nothing real.
But the 5 miners, they didn't back down. They stood by every word, every shot fired, every moment of that night.
They insisted that they hadn't made it up, hadn't exaggerated, hadn't staged anything. They told the same story again and again, and they never changed it.
Which leaves us with something far more unsettling than any simple answer.
Because either 5 men walked into the wilderness and created one of the most convincing hoaxes of their time, or they survived something real and left behind almost no proof it was ever there. Chapter 7. The Seaithic.
And while the rest of the world began to pull back, to question, to doubt what those men had claimed they lived through, one man stepped forward. A different voice, not louder, but older.
A man named George Todsky, a member of the Callum tribe and the editor of a native-run newspaper called The Real American. And what he offered wasn't belief, and it wasn't dismissal. It was something else entirely. According to Todsky, the story didn't begin in 1924. It didn't begin with 5 miners in a cabin. His people and others like them had known of something like this for generations.
They called them the Seaithic.
Other tribes had different names, different words, but the descriptions, they lined up in the same ways that were hard to ignore. Enormous figures, 7, maybe 8 feet tall, bodies covered in thick hair, living deep in the mountains, moving between places most people would never find. Not passing through by accident, living there, belonging there.
And suddenly the miner's story didn't sound so isolated anymore. But Todsky, he didn't stop there.
Because in his telling, these weren't animals, not creatures to be hunted, not things to be explained away. They were kind of people, separated from human tribes, but people nonetheless. And according to the stories passed down, they weren't just strong, they were aware, intelligent in ways that didn't always make sense. He spoke of abilities that sounded almost impossible, the kind of things that blur the line between reality and something else entirely. The ability to mimic the calls of birds perfectly, not just one, but any of them. The ability to throw their voices to make a sound seem like it came from somewhere else, somewhere further away, or closer, drawing you in, or pushing you off course.
And then there was something even harder to explain. They had a kind of influence over animals they hunted, not chasing them, not tracking them, but guiding them.
As if the forest itself was working with them. Todsky said he didn't just rely on his own tribe's stories, but spoke with others, compared accounts. And what he found was consistent. The Seaithic were known to pass through the Mount St. Helens region around the same time of year the miners had been there. They didn't stay long, they moved through. And more importantly, they were not known to be violent, not without reason, not without cause. They were considered harmless if left alone. And that part matters.
Because in every version of those oldest stories, every warning passed down through generations, well, there was one thing that never changed.
You do not harm one of them. Because if you do, it doesn't end there. It doesn't stay contained to a single moment, a single encounter, a single mistake. It grows. It escalates. The response, according to those stories, wasn't measured. It was overwhelming.
And just like that, everything that had happened in that canyon, everything the miners described, started to take on a different shape. Not random, not chaotic, not an attack without reason, but something else.
Something that sounded a lot like retaliation. Because if those stories held even a fragment of truth, then what happened at that cabin might not have been the beginning. And it might not have been the first time someone pulled a trigger without understanding what they were aiming at. Chapter 8. The Skeptics Strike Back.
Word of the encounter spread fast in those first few days, but doubt spread faster.
At first, people leaned in. They listened. They imagined it. 5 men, a remote cabin, something in the dark surrounding them. It had all the weight of a real story, the kind that sticks. But then the tone shifted, slowly at first, then all at once. What had been awe turned into skepticism. What had been fear turned into quiet dismissal. And before long, the story that had gripped people across the country started to draw something else entirely. Eye rolls. People began to look closer, not at the mountains, not at the canyon, but at the men. Who were they, really?
And, well, it didn't take long before something surfaced.
The 5 miners weren't just prospectors, they were spiritualists, men who believed in things beyond the physical, men who held seances, sometimes out in the woods themselves. And just like that, a new explanation took shape. Maybe they hadn't seen something real. Maybe they'd only seen what they were already prepared to see. In that version of the story, the answer was simple. They'd encountered something ordinary, something explainable, maybe even something as familiar as a black bear. And in the dark, with minds already tuned toward the supernatural, they turned it into something else. Something bigger, something impossible. And to a lot of people, that made sense.
But not everyone agreed, because there was another way to look at it.
If these were men used to the woods, used to isolation, used to sitting in the dark and inviting the unknown, well then wouldn't they be the last people to panic, the last to mistake something ordinary for something extraordinary? Wouldn't they be harder to shake, not easier? And that's where the story started to split. 2 explanations, both reasonable, both flawed, and no way to prove either one. That uncertainty, that lack of something solid to hold onto, it started to wear the story down. Slowly, piece by piece, it lost its grip on the public. What had once felt like a mystery started to feel like noise.
And then came the simplest stories, the kind that try to bring everything back down to earth.
Some suggested the entire incident could have been nothing more than a prank, local teenagers throwing light pumice stones into the canyon for fun. In the dark, with echoes bouncing off rock walls, voices twisting and stretching through distance, that could have sounded like something far worse. Something alive, something hunting. And for 5 men already shaken, already on edge, maybe that was enough.
I mean, it sounded neat, it sounded logical. But it didn't explain everything.
Because the rangers had found stones, not just light ones, but heavy ones too. The kind that don't travel easily, the kind that raise more questions than the answer.
And then there were the tracks. Now, okay, I know what you're thinking. What about the footprints?
Didn't the rangers say they looked like they were made with knuckles? And that's true, they did say that.
But let me ask you something. Have you ever looked at the foot of an ape?
Not just glanced at it, but looked. Because when you do, you start to notice something strange. They don't look like our feet, they look a lot like hands. Long, flexible, almost built to grip instead of just walk. So if something like that was pressing into the ground, would it leave behind something that looks like a footprint? Or something that looks like knuckles?
Now, I'm not saying that that's the answer, all right? I'm not saying it proves anything, but it does make you pause. Because the more you look at this story, well, the less certain everything becomes.
Chapter 9. Beck's response.
Now, here's where it gets strange. For most of their lives, all the men held on to their story, same details, same order of events. All except one.
Beck stayed quiet. Decades of quiet. Not one word about that night until 1966 when he was finally cornered into an interview. He didn't go looking for the spotlight came looking for him.
And if you have to understand why, right around then, everybody started caring again.
The 1960s were obsessed with wild men. Reports were coming out of the Himalayas about some creature the papers had nicknamed the Abominable Snowman, and all of a sudden America wanted its own. So people went digging back through old cases, and digging led them straight back to a canyon in Washington, to a story that was already older than most of them. So they came for Beck, and he talked. Here's the thing, though. Even the men who told this story the same way for 40 years couldn't agree on one detail: how many creatures were actually out there that night. Some said 15, some said 30, some swore it was more than that, more than they could even count in the dark with the cabin walls shaking around them. 15, 30, maybe more, nobody really knows.
But as strange as that disagreement was, it wasn't the strangest part of what came next.
Because when Beck finally sat down to write his book in 1967, he added something nobody expected, something none of the other men had ever said before or since. He said the creatures weren't just animals. He said they might have been part physical and part spiritual, something that could exist in our world and slip back out of it, like they didn't fully belong to either side. And here's what makes it worse. We're not sure if the other miners themselves knew. They just never spoke about it. Whatever Beck believed he saw that night, whatever conclusion he'd quietly come to sitting with it for 40 years, he kept it to himself until he finally put it on paper. And if he's right, maybe that's exactly why nobody in all this time has ever found a body, not a bone, not one single piece of hard evidence.
Something that can slip out of our world, well, doesn't exactly leave much behind.
Chapter 10. Where we are today.
Now, if there was ever a time for Bigfoot lovers to dig into this story, well, it's now. But here's the problem. The trail's gone cold. Actually, really cold.
On May the 18th, 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted. 57 people died that day, and the surrounding landscape, including Spirit Lake and the entire area where all of this supposedly happened, got buried. Ash, mudflow, debris. Whatever was left of that cabin, whatever physical trace remained of the 1924 story, it was wiped off the map in a single afternoon.
But in 2013, a researcher named Mark Myersel decided to go looking anyway.
Working off old photographs and historical accounts, he set out to relocate the original cabin site. And somehow, he found it. A location where the physical details lined up almost perfectly with the record. No Bigfoot remains, no bones, nothing supernatural sitting there waiting to be found. But there were spent rifle cartridges sitting right there in the debris, exactly consistent with the firefight Beck had been describing for over 80 years.
So, think about what that means. The cabin was real, the setting was real. 5 men really did stand in that clearing in July of 1924, and they really did fire real bullets. Into the dark. It's something.
What that something was, we will never know. Animal, spirit, prank, or just a story that kept growing every single time it was told. Chapter 11. The End.
So here we are. Every theory that we've laid out tonight is sitting right in front of you. Take your pick.
Maybe it was a band of undiscovered primates, real flesh and blood cryptids that have somehow slipped past every camera, every expedition, every search party for 100 years. Maybe it was the Seaithic, exactly as the Clallam and the neighboring tribes described them, generations before any miner ever set foot in that canyon. Or maybe it's simpler than all of that. A handful of young men, a canyon that twists sound in ways that plays tricks on the mind, and one night that spiraled into something far more terrifying than it ever should have been.
And then there's Fred Beck.
After 40 years of turning it over, questioning it, living with it every single day, he landed on one answer. Not animal, not prank. He came to believe that whatever surrounded that cabin was never truly physical at all. Something that didn't belong here. Something extra-dimensional that forced its way into our world for one violent night, and then slipped back out.
And maybe that's the real question that's hanging over this story. Not what theory you believe, because, well, if Fred Beck was right, the question was never whether Ape Canyon happened. The question is whether whatever was out there that night is still out there now.
Thank you for staying with me all the way till the end, and thank you for being here for the very first one. This is where it all starts. Every week I'll bring you another one of these forgotten stories, cases, the time buried, stories that just might prove Bigfoot really is out there, watching. And this channel isn't just going to be about stories. If you've ever had a close encounter of your own, or you know someone who has, send it in. You can reach us by mail. Your story might be the one I'm telling next. So subscribe, share this with someone who needs to see it, hit like and turn on notifications so you don't miss next week.
And this is only the start. Steve out.